Meet my Lomi. Lomi is a kitchen composter made by Pella, and they make numerous claims about this device. In this video, I'm going to have a look at 4 of the main claims to see if they're right, and that will help you decide if you should buy one of these units. Here are the claims. Lomi reduces waste. It's eco-friendly. It composts some plastics, and it makes compost. Claim number 1, does it reduce waste? This is taken right from their own website. You'll be shocked at how much less waste you produce each week. They also say, Lomi makes your family's food waste disappear at the push of a button. Lomi uses the fact that it reduces food waste as one of its main selling features. Reducing food waste is good for the environment. It's good for climate change. And I agree. But does Lomi actually reduce food waste? Lomi uses this image to prove their point. The before image shows a full container of food scraps, and the after shows about 80% reduction. What they are showing you here is correct, but their conclusion is wrong. Food waste is mostly plant material and a lot of air. Plant material is 80% water. When you remove the water and some of the air, you do end up with a volume that is 80% less. But note the word volume. The volume is less, but the amount of waste is exactly the same before and after processing. If you were to take both samples to a lab and ask them to measure the amount of organic matter in them, the lab would dry the samples and then weigh them. These 2 samples would weigh exactly the same amount because both the before and the after sample have exactly the same amount of organic matter. Lomi removes water. It does not reduce the amount of waste you produce. For this reason, both samples have an identical effect on the environment. Statements like, Lomi makes your family's food waste disappear at the push of a button are simply wrong. This is called greenwashing, making something look like it is better for the environment when it really isn't. Claim number 2, Lomi is eco-friendly. They claim it is good for the environment, and to convince you of that, they use some math and show you how eco-friendly the product is. Here's an example. On the left, you have a situation without Lomi, and you produce 0.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. On the right, we have the Lomi way, and it only produces 0.17 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That's a reduction of 65%. We all know CO2 is bad for climate change, and so Lomi is clearly better. But is it really? Lomi uses a sneaky marketing trick here. They are comparing apples to oranges, and then they conclude oranges are sweeter. The left side sends the kitchen scraps to landfill, and the right side uses them in the garden. This is not a fair comparison. It is important that you understand this because so many eco-friendly companies are now using this marketing trick to get you to buy stuff. We have 2 scenarios here. Either send the material to landfill or use it in the garden. Let's look at the landfill case first and do a real comparison. If the kitchen scraps are put into the garbage and sent to landfill, they get covered with other garbage and then it gets compressed, which removes most of the air. Without air, the kitchen scraps decompose to produce a lot of methane, which is CH4. Methane is 30 times worse than CO2 for global warming. If, on the other hand, we put the material in Lomi first and then send it to landfill, we have the situation on the right side. Lomi removes the water, which requires electricity. Producing electricity produces CO2. Since the material weighs less, it does take less diesel fuel to get it to the landfill site, which is a saving of produced CO2. Since the organic matter is exactly the same with Lomi and without Lomi, both will produce the same exact amount of methane when they get to landfill. So far in the comparison, the 2 options affect the environment about the same, but there's one other factor that needs to be added in, and that is the environmental cost of manufacturing Lomi and disposing of it at the end of its life, not to mention the environmental cost of shipping it to you. All of these things have a negative effect on the environment. When you add it all up, Lomi is clearly a worse option for the environment in this scenario. It is not eco-friendly. Now let's take a look at the other case of using the material in the garden or in flower pots. On the left, the material is composted, and this process does produce CO2 gas. The finished compost is then added to soil, increasing the organic matter level. On the right side, we have the Lomi option. Lomi dries the material, and that requires electricity. It is then moved to the garden where it completes the composting process, either in a compost pile or spread out as mulch. Since the amount of organic matter has not changed, both options produce the same amount of CO2 when the material composts. Lomi does not change the amount of CO2 produced, and the dehydration is a waste since the material just rehydrates when it's placed in soil or in a compost pile. Again, we have to add in the environmental cost of manufacturing and disposing of the unit. When we add it all up, Lomi is worse for the environment in this scenario as well. What about using a green bin for kitchen scrap? The analysis is the same as for backyard composting. It is better for the environment to just use the green bin and skip the electronic composter. It's clear to me that Lomi is not an eco-friendly option. Claim number 3. Lomi decomposes different types of compostable plastic. Commercial composting facilities run very efficiently. They get the mixed materials, the greens and browns, just right, and they control temperature accurately. Then they compost the material for weeks. Almost none of these facilities can compost biodegradable plastic or compostable plastic. These materials require 90 days of composting at a higher temperature. There are only a few facilities in North America that can compost plastic. Lomi does not have a chance at composting this material. Claim number 4. Lomi makes compost. I have examined this thoroughly and tested the material at the end of the grow mode with pods, which should produce the best compost material. But it's not compost. I'll link to my video showing you the results in a few seconds. So what does Lomi do? It produces dried kitchen scraps. Should you buy such a machine? If you plan to use the electronic composter and then send the material to landfill, don't do it. It is better to just send your kitchen scraps to landfill and skip the drying process. If you have a garden and you're going to compost, don't use the machine. Even if you have a garden and you're not going to compost, take those kitchen scraps and bury them in the soil. That's better than drying them first. If your city uses a green bin and they do the composting, put the kitchen scraps in the green bin, but don't dry them. All the drying does is increase your carbon footprint. Now, if you don't have a garden, you have no way of composting, an electronic composter does make some sense if you take the dried kitchen scraps and get them in the soil somewhere. Give them to a friend. Take them out in the park and dump the material. It has to end up in the soil. If you end up sending it to landfill or you put it in a green bin, skip the drying process. Now here's a link to my video that tests the composting part of Lomi. And if you want to learn more about composting, have a look at my book, Composting Science for Gardeners. Happy gardening.